You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet. Academics estimate that there are tens of thousands of new religious movements, often referred to as cults, operating worldwide. The majority is said to be in Africa and Asia. Here in Britain, there's thought to be between 500 and 1,000 new religious movements, or cults, but that figure is said by some to be a conservative estimate. To discuss the growing phenomena of cults or new religious movements, I'm joined by Ian Howarth, founder and current General Secretary of the Cult Information Centre, a non-sectarian educational charity based in London. He's worked full-time as a specialist in cults since 1979, and he is himself a former cult member. Journalist Lynn Wallace, who has written extensively for newspapers on cults and families affected by new religious movements, including an article for the Times educational supplement in 2008 called Cult Watch, detailing the danger cults pose to young people. Also taking part in the panel discussion is Natasha Tormé, author of Born into the Children of God, My Life in a Religious Sex Cult, and Cults, the Bloodstained History of Organised Religion. Natasha Tormé was born and raised within the Children of God, a religious cult that became infamous for its bizarre practices and religious doctrines. Natasha escaped at 18. Natasha, I'll start with you. How did you leave?
It was quite a long process. So the doubt started when I was, sort of 14 years of age, when most teenagers are starting their rebellious years, so to speak. But obviously on top of the usual teenage angst, I had that additional, circumstance of being, living in a cult in a very... At that time we were in France, so it was very difficult because we had to kind of hide everything we did all the time and, kind of live a bit in secrecy and never talk about what was going on at home or that we were part of the cult. And that's really when all my doubts started. And as I got older, sort of going on to 16, 17, I started to have a little bit more interaction with the outside world. And, slowly I began to realize just how strange my living situation was. And by the time I reached 18, that was it.
What interaction did you have with the outside world at any point in your time there?
Well, up until the age of 13, almost none. So in Thailand and in the Asian countries that we lived in very big communes, sometimes of 100, 150 people. Very much your typical sort of compound community where, you've got very high walls, big security gates, and it was a very well-run operation in the sense that they managed to go basically unnoticed, with these huge communes living together. They didn't actually attract that much attention. But obviously, us children weren't allowed to leave the compound. And when we did, it was very rare and always obviously supervised by adults, either to go help fundraising by doing shows or things like that. So very minimal for the first 13 years. And then when we moved to France, obviously in France you couldn't have those kind of big communes. They would have been noticed straight away. So it was very small communes. So it was usually just my family and then one or two other people. So obviously there was a little bit more freedom, They couldn't watch us all the time. So we had very small interactions. And then by the time I reached 16, I was kind of jumping out my window at night and things like that.
And what were the questions you were asking yourself when you were there? You started questioning why you were, your existence within this cult at sort of 13 to 18, and 18, you were jumping out the windows, wanting to leave. What was there a catalyst for this?
Well, a very key moment for me, obviously the doubt started slowly, but a key moment for me was in 2000 when they predicted, I think it was their third or fourth prediction of the end of the world. And it didn't happen, obviously. We were all, extremely afraid on New Year's Eve. We had a stash of food. We were prepared for the Armageddon, basically. And yet again, it didn't happen. And that, for me, was kind of the final straw. I thought, that's when I really realized this is just all lies. None of it's true. And yeah, I went from there.
And what if you could, what was it like to be in you'd wake up in the morning and what would be expected of you?
It would depend sort of which period we're talking about. If, in Thailand, where it was much stricter in those kind of communes, all the children were separated into groups. And we all had very strict schedules. So it was, you wake up, you've got 10 minutes to make your bed and get dressed. All the kids wore uniforms. And whoever was looking after us, who we would call, our auntie or our uncle, then it was just very, very regimented. Everyone in single file marched downstairs for breakfast. You had a certain amount of time to eat. Everyone marched back upstairs. Many hours, obviously, of being read, either the stories from the Bible or publications from the leader Berg or Zerby. And then we had, in some homes you had school time, which again was not really school because, apart from learning how to read and write, it was all based around the cult leader's theology and his beliefs. So all of our education about history and science was all, according to the cult leader's version, with a lot of religion mixed in.
I'm sure we'll have many more questions for you and probably will come back, but just to sort of bring in the rest of the panel members here. Ian, what made you set up the Cult Information Centre? And would you say it's very widely used and known?
It is known internationally, and it's very easy to find in the UK just by going online. What provoked me to set up the centre is that I came back to the UK in 1987 from Canada, where I'd been doing this. I set up the first charity of its kind in Canada. So really what provoked me to get into the field is what provoked me to set up the first charity in Canada, which was called COMA, Council on Mind Abuse. And it was just that I'd gone through a nightmare experience in a group. I'd only been in the group for 2.5 weeks. I managed to escape thanks to a journalist. It then took me 11 months to recover. And in that recovery time, the tragic deaths in Jonestown, Guyana occurred, where 913 people died following the orders of Jim Jones. And I realised that that could have happened to me if, I could relate to those people. And when the Canadian media started to ask, is this a problem in our country? I went forward and said, yes, it is. And so that led to a lot of media coverage. And then my desire to try and be involved in an educational process to try and warn people. And so that's how it all started.
You called it mind abuse. Is this something that we don't really understand?
Most people have no idea what constitutes psychological coercion, mind control, or radicalisation. And I'm using my terms carefully because radicalisation, although it's usually used in connection with terrorist groups, it's the same thing as what we've been describing as mind control or psychological coercion or thought reform for many years. People are processed to become terrorists. People are processed to become cult victims. And in my case, I was 31 when I was recruited into a group. And I was theirs. I was completely under their control by the third day. So I mention that because I want to emphasize how quick this process is. After just 2 evenings and 1 morning on a course in Toronto, I was theirs. I gave them all the money I had, dedicated my life to it, and resigned from my job. But as you know, I fortunately managed to escape very quickly, thanks to a journalist helping me.
And do you think in Britain, it's the lack of understanding of the techniques used in what we just said as mind abuse is understood, and therefore people, maybe it might blow up in the media 10 years ago, but then it sort of settles down a bit, and then there's a sort of fascination about what goes on in a cult, and they read about it, and then suddenly it dies down again, and no one really takes it very seriously.
Well, of course, it's never going to happen to me. I mean, that's normally the attitude, I think. And I think people that do consider what a cult might be assume that it's probably some kind of strange organisation that will be visually identifiable, that a cult recruiter that will therefore be obvious when he or she approaches you, that probably the people that are recruited are probably not very intelligent, they're probably on drugs anyway, and people make all kinds of excuses as to why someone would join. What we're saying, though, is that people don't join, they're recruited instead, and they're recruited through subtle techniques, and the techniques work and work very effectively. The easiest people to recruit, in fact, tend to be well-educated people, people with average to above average intelligence, and they think it would never happen to them. The safest seem to be the very seriously mentally ill, which isn't very comforting.
Lynn Wallace, you were sort of nodding in agreement there, and having sort of written lots of articles in the media. What made you write about cults?
It's a long time ago when I started, actually. It's probably more than 15 years. I think I met somebody who'd lost her daughter to a group, probably better not mention their name, and her daughter had been working in a West End department store. She'd just left university. She was new to London. I think this is a really common time for people to be recruited when they're in a new city and they're vulnerable. Sometimes when they just start university. And she came home one evening and said she'd been invited to a women's meeting at Wembley, and it turned out to be a recruitment fair for this particular group. And very, very quickly she was sucked in. This woman, Betty, her daughter, was receiving messages on her mobile. She was being love-bombed, told she was awesome. And within about a month, she'd lost weight, she wasn't eating properly, her sense of humour. In other words, she'd undergone a complete sort of personality transformation. She'd really had her own personality sucked out of her and had everything had been replaced by the sort of values of this group. And then I met Ian Howarth, and he put stories my way sometimes, and I've interviewed probably scores, not hundreds, probably scores of ex-members of groups, but also families who've lost sons and daughters.
And as a journalist, what would you say you witnessed the legacy of what the cult has done on these individuals and these families?
Yeah.
You're highlighting an issue. Where do you think that it needs to be highlighted further?
I think it does. I think awareness is very, very low. I think Ian's absolutely right that everyone says it could never happen to me. It can happen to anyone at a particular time in their lives when they're vulnerable. I think it should probably be on the curriculum. You know, kids going off to university, the parents warn them about STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, drugs and alcohol, but whoever thinks to tell them about the damage that these groups can do? Maybe even the parents don't think it can happen to their children. I think it really is high time that something was done, because this has been going on for too long.
This is one of the things that we do. We go out and give lectures. I'm spending an entire day this week at a school that has this on the curriculum. But as Lynn has suggested, that's not necessarily the norm. But I do go around various schools and colleges and sometimes universities to talk about this phenomenon. And fortunately, I sometimes speak to professional groups as well, because they're losing people to the cults. A lot of people imagine it's that the typical recruit is young, but it happens at all ages. Captains of industry are being recruited into cults as well.
It sounds a very aggressive style of recruitment. Could you tell me more about that?
Well, yes. Everyone that's recruited is programmed to understand that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Your critical abilities are now severely impaired. And so if the group says that 2 and 2 is 7, it is. And you excitedly share that with people. The two main goals seem to be to bring in money and to bring in people. It's quite normal to be sent out to recruit others. Now, if you're in a cult that we would call a therapy cult, where you stay in your job, then you'll be doing that after hours and on weekends. If you're in your typical religious cult, where you're working for the group full-time, then you're doing that full-time. So you're constantly going out there and trying to recruit people, usually by, unfortunately, lying to them, misrepresenting what it is that you stand for. And if people that you're talking to ask questions, then you'll be very vague all of a sudden about what's really going on, because they just want you to cross the threshold, and then a sort of psychological door closes behind you. And as Lynn was saying, you become someone else. And it's interesting, we're doing the voice of Russia today, because I often compare this with Russian dolls. The real you is now covered over by a new personality. That's the outer doll, if you will, and that's the one that interacts with family and friends and the world. The real you, however, the good news is inside. Getting that real you out is another matter altogether, and there's no guarantee that that will ever happen.
And as part of this sort of recruitment process, I think quite early on, anyone who dares to challenge anything that's said by any of the leaders in one of their sort of brainwashing, mind control sessions, punishment and reward is introduced quite early on, I think, and someone will be shunned or maybe ostracised if they dare to disagree. Obviously, in any kind of healthy environment, perhaps a sort of, an actual sort of proper kosher religion, questioning is encouraged, but within these groups, it's quashed, very, very early on.
Natasha, you're agreeing, obviously.
Yeah.
Having heard from both Ian and Lynn, why do you think people don't understand cults or are scared to talk about them?
Obviously, what Ian's saying is completely correct. I think people completely underestimate how powerful cults are when it comes to recruitment. So if we take the Children of God, for example, who still exist today, or even back when I was a teenager, they operated, for example, in African countries under fake names. They had humanitarian organizations with completely different names to the Children of God or the Family International, which they're now called. And, they'd be out there, these homes with, all these young couples with kids, age 20 to 30, all living together, having a great time, doing all this humanitarian work. I mean, for many young people who, would bump into them, it'd be like, wow, I mean, this is amazing. I can do something with my life. I can, help others and help save the world. But behind all that, obviously, is a completely different story. Once you get pulled in through that, exciting new world, very quickly the trap closes and you find out that actually you only saw the tip of the iceberg here. Now you're going to see the real deal. But by then it's usually too late. You're completely sucked in, and it's very difficult after that to get out. And like Lynn was saying, voicing doubts, anyone who dares to voice doubts, even at the beginning, either they'll be completely rejected, punished, in a psychological way, as a means of control and as a warning to other members that, you cannot contradict the leadership. So often in the Children of God, for example, people who were considered severe doubters would be separated from their spouse or their children and sent on one thing I talk about in the book is when my mother, for example, dared to defend one of her children who was being very harshly disciplined physically by other aunties and uncles in the home. And she dared to say something against it and was sent to Chelyabinsk for 6 months when she was pregnant. And, high radiation and everything, and minus 40 degrees. And that was basically, she was being taught a lesson by the leadership that this is what will happen to you. And we can keep you there if we want to. And we can send you somewhere else. And you may never see your children again. And it was as much a lesson to my father, who was left behind, as to, you better keep your wife in check. So it's all these psychological things, but all done in a very, how do you call it?
It's for your own good.
Yes, it's for your own good. This is the Lord trying to teach you a lesson. This is good for you. This is good for your family. It will make you a better disciple, etc. So, yeah.
And what is it like when you speak to the families?
Well, they're devastated. It's like a sort of living bereavement. If their person is still in the group, there's all sorts of conflicting advice about whether you should try and get the child out. They normally have an incredibly hard time making contact. That someone else will answer the phone, they're not around. They just don't know what to do. They are at a loss. Sometimes that child, sometimes it's a grown person, their light will come on and they'll come out and have some counselling or something. But I know several families who've had sons and daughters in for years. And I don't know if this is right, Ian, but isn't it true that the longer they're in, the less likely it is that they will come out? Is that right?
No, not as far as I'm concerned. Some people do say that, though. You're quite right. Some would say that. I've never said that. Some have said in the past that after a particular point in time, that's it. But I've never seen any kind of need for saying that. I've known people who've come out of cults after 30 years and fully recovered. And
is it possible for everyone to recover? I mean, have you found your recovery path was a sort of a therapeutic path by writing your book, Natasha?
Definitely, yes. Writing the book was sort of the final step in my healing process. But, I've been out of the cult 12 years now, and it's taken that long. Obviously, it's like Lynn was saying earlier, the process of manipulation, for someone who joins a cult is that, stripping down that personality and replacing it with, this cult personality. But when you're born into a cult, you never have the chance to form that personality at the start. So the road to recovery is, the first big question is, who am I? Down to silly things. What is my personality? You don't even know who you are as a person. What kind of clothes do I like to wear? What's my style? What kind, everything has to be learned from scratch about yourself. And then after that, you can start properly, healing. But it takes years. It's taken me years to sort of go through that whole process and finally get to a point now where I actually know who I am and I'm comfortable with it and I can move on.
And what would you say to, if you could, if there was one instance where you could have a voice to people who are on the cusp of wanting to change, who might be in the same cult that you were, what would you say to them?
I'd say that I know how scary it is to even contemplate facing a world that either you've never known or that you have lost touch with for many years. But once you get out there, you realize that there's actually nothing to be afraid about, that there's actually a lot of people who understand and who won't judge you. I think that's a big thing when people, especially people who joined a cult voluntarily, they feel like somehow, no one's going to understand. They're going to blame me. They're going to think I was stupid, that I deserve, whatever happens to me. When, people don't see it like that. There are plenty of professionals out there and, institutes like the Cult Information Center that are there to help, and they understand and know that, these people, you're victims. You're not actually thinking in your right mind. So it's really, not judging yourself and kind of accepting that you are a victim and that you need help. I think that's the biggest difficulty for some.
There is another thing here, and that is that it's not the best thing to put on your CV when you're looking for a job. And so that's one of the other problems here, because there are a lot of high-profile people who are ex-cult members who would not dare do what Natasha's bravely doing and talk about their story. I know a senior partner in a major law firm in this city who's an ex-cult member. And I know other people in other similar institutions, and there are teachers and there are doctors who are ex-cult members. It's not something you really want to broadcast because you might lose some clients, if not all of them. And yet there are, as Natasha says, a lot of people who are aware of the phenomenon, and help is available. And I welcome Natasha's book and hope that it does well to inform people about this growing phenomenon.
Do the right people understand the level of this, what seems to be an exploitation of mind abuse?
No, I don't believe they do. The mental health profession is sorely lacking in an understanding of this phenomenon. There used to be one psychiatrist in Britain that was really good and could help just about anybody, and sadly she died about 5 years ago. There is another psychiatrist now that's up on this, but because she works for the NHS, she's only able to deal with clients in a limited geographic area. There are very, very few mental health professionals that begin to understand the phenomenon, but there are a small handful of people that do. There are a couple of people with a background in psychology that are very good at counselling people, and they work inside our field and they work in the academic world as well. And then there are a couple of other people who specialise in counselling cult victims, and they're trained counsellors, and they're very good. But it's still, as a country, we're really lacking in understanding this phenomenon. We're way behind the rest of Europe, unfortunately.
And when you say the phenomenon, and I said at the beginning, is estimated to be maybe 500 to 1,000, what numbers would you say now?
Well, you're quoting the figures I would use.
Yeah.
And I am accused of being conservative, and I prefer to be that. But it's a growing problem. And it is getting worse. Hopefully, it's not as bad as it would be if there weren't voices like ours. But that's a hard thing to measure. But I think if people started to recognise that cults are here to stay, and there's a tremendous need to be a lot more discerning and just simply question. People spend a lot more time checking out a new car than they do checking out a group that they may be interested in getting involved with. And a new car may break down, but if it's a cult, then you'll be the one breaking down, and it's a completely different ballgame and a very serious one.
Can I ask any of you, finally really, why you think it might be getting worse? Lynn?
I'm not sure about why, but I think that an awful lot of groups seem to be setting up on the back of these sort of health and well-being groups and yoga groups. I mean, every single newspaper has a massive Great Health section there full of this sort of new agey type stuff. And I think there are a lot of groups. And within that, I've seen the growth of sort of abusive one-on-one relationships, not situations where someone is sucked into a group, but where one person targets another and usually ends up taking a vast amount of money from them. They tend to target people who have some wealth. And I've interviewed, I think, 3 or 4 people who've been in that situation. I don't know, maybe it is the breakdown of religion and people not going to church anymore, family breakdown. But more importantly, I think there's nothing really to stop them. It's sort of unregulated. There isn't a body that actually has any clout who can monitor these groups. And we are behind the rest of Europe. And the awareness is just incredibly low. I guess politically it's not a vote winner. It affects a relatively few number of people. And politicians don't take the long-term view, do they? They take the next 4 years. And
for me, there are 2 issues here. One is, statistically, if each person that's recruited becomes a recruiter and recruits 4 or 5 other people at a minimum, then cults are bound to grow at a tremendous rate. But they do. But the other side of it is that as cults continue, they become wealthier and wealthier, and they get the best lawyers in the city. And there are lots of stories we give to the media that don't see the light of day. The journalist gets paid, but it's not published because people don't want to get sued. And so that's another aspect. There is a control, there is an influence on the media, and that's most unfortunate.
We started with you, Natasha, and so I'd like to sort of end with a final word from you, if that's okay. I guess you could either say whatever you like, having heard from us here today, and I think it's incredible that you were so brave to take the step that you did at 18 and start questioning. Is there a real lesson that you've learned that you think you would like to impart, or that you think that actually society as a whole would benefit from knowing, especially in Britain, where, as Ian says, and Lynn, it's a very sort of beneath the radar, tightly controlled, influenced. The media is influenced by very highly paid law firms who are able to represent these new religious movements. What would your sort of lasting comments be?
Well, I completely agree. I think one of the big issues is, people being afraid to trample on religious freedom. And there's a fine line between, overanalyzing every religious group. Is it a cult? Is it not? And where we are now, where cults can operate so easily. I mean, Lynn was saying about, New Age groups and things like that. That is one of the, probably, I would think, one of the rising areas where cults will take advantage of groups like this to be able to recruit people. And it's not a new thing. I mean, if you look back at the Order of the Solar Temple not so long ago, who ended with, I think, about 70-something suicides, they recruited in exactly the same way. So Luc Jouret, one of the 2 leaders, he used to hold these conferences on alternative medicines and, New Age healing methods and things like that. And that's how we recruited a lot of very rich and very powerful people. And I think it's what people need to be very aware of is a group or a person who just seems overly caring. If you're going through a difficult time or you're feeling lonely or you just had a loss, and you meet a group or several people who, there's that instant, we love you, you're one of us, It's not, I'm not saying that everyone should be paranoid and wary, because the world wouldn't be a very nice place. But sometimes something that's too good to be true is really too good to be true. And I think, awareness, again, I think that's the most important thing. And that's what, all of us here are trying to do. And there's a long road to go before we get to a place where, people are actually aware of these dangers and are looking out for them and, not falling into the trap.
That was Natasha Tormé, author of Cults, A Bloodstained History of Organised Religion. And I was also joined by Lynn Wallace, freelance journalist who's written extensively about cults, and founder and general secretary of Cult Information Centre, Ian Howarth.